Hello, everyone. I am so glad that you are watching this, either recorded or live. My name is Tatiana. I'm coming to you live from Athens, Greece. I see a beautiful port of Porto Rafti behind me, and you may notice a different background. I am in my house in Greece. And this month, I wanted to bring up the very important topic of being a good listener while you're in a virtual session, either with another person or with several other people in meetings. As I see you coming in from different places, I'm going to remind you to drop in the hashtag stronger, because we always raffle away a tumbler that goes with this newsletter. A few months back, I was in a virtual meeting that was, to me, pretty stressful. It was a virtual meeting where I was being given difficult news. And because it was virtual, it was more difficult for me to read the room. It was more difficult for me to connect with the person I was speaking with and to try to get a sense of where he was coming from. There were politics involved, there was sort of backdrop involved, and I'm not going to lie to you that I was not being a very good listener, or I was worried about not being a very good listener. And with that information or with that motivation in mind, I thought, why not share this month stronger on what we can do to be better listeners in virtual settings. There's so many things that are different when you share the space, when you share the air with another person. I can't think of a better friend and colleague and LinkedIn Learning instructor than Brenda Bailey-Hughes, who I'm going to ask to come in to the room right now, because Brenda and I have a very popular effective listening course that has over 1.5 million learners. Cheers to that. Yay. So when we have been designing the course on how people learn how to listen, we learned how important of a skill it is, or even learned it even more. As the research says, we get to practice it every day, but we don't really learn it in school. So Jay is here, and I sent you the link, Jay. Varun is joining us also from Georgia, and hopefully more people will come in as well. Brenda, we've talked about listening for many years, and you and I have also said if we got to revise the course, we definitely would add a section on listening in a virtual setting. What has been your first thing you think about when you think of listening virtually?
Well, I wouldn't even just add a section. I think so many of us listen virtually now that it's ubiquitous to listening, that it's just a part of our everyday lives. So I think it would just be integrated throughout the entire course. We would just assume that if we're talking about listening, about meetings, about conversations, we are talking about all of that remote, right? So that is one thing that occurs to me. The other thing that occurs to me is that I thought I was a decent, maybe even good listener in face-to-face settings, and going remote more and more often has shaken my confidence that I'm as good of a listener as I've always thought that I was. Or it's actually it's a different skill set, or the same skill set, but on steroids. I don't know. How are you feeling about your remote listening?
You know, it depends on how many meetings I have back to back. I think that early in the morning when my energy is good and I'm focused and concentrated, and I don't have this sort of close the door, open the door, and seeing new people and hearing new ideas. Earlier on, I'm a better listener. Towards the end of the day, if I've been in front of the screen and I interact constantly in this virtual setting, I don't think I am a good listener. So I've been more aware of that, right?
Right. And you could probably make the same argument of your face-to-face settings, right? That as the day goes on, as the meetings grow longer and your energy level goes down, your listening goes down. But I think that is all intensified online or in remote virtual settings. And maybe that is just to emphasize that some of the foundational skills of listening replicate themselves in a remote setting. Some of them some skills are different though.
Yeah. Well, and we listen for different reasons. Like we talk about that in our course. We have listening for big picture, listening for details. Should we review that for our learners?
Yeah, but you should review that for me.
And by the way, as people are coming in and listening to the course on listening virtually, tell us where you're coming in from, and don't forget to hashtag stronger so we can help you win one of the tumblers. So
Yes.
what are the
Okay,
different?
so as we're talking about these different types of listening, I think it'd be great if the people coming on sort of self-evaluate. If you had to think about which is my strength, which is my weakness, how would you rank yourself on these? I think there's 5, right? Different types of listening that we talk about in the course. So I know one of them that is my weakness is recalling details. I'm horrible about that, just horrible. Yeah. So recalling details when you're looking at those really, like if I have to act on it later, there needs to be a note. Or if it's a really specific, finite kind of information, boy, that is hard for me to hold on to.
Yeah. Because for me, my strength, I'm really bad at listening for details. My strength is listening beyond just the words, paying attention to someone's facial expressions or how they are sitting or the tone of voice that they use to try to read between the lines of what do they really mean, or are they nervous, are they excited, are they in, anxious about what they're saying. So while I'm doing that, I don't do a very good job paying attention to the details, and I know I frustrate many people. And as you said, keeping notepad and paper close by would be helpful. What were the other types of listening we talked about in our course?
Well, I was going to also ask you, I wonder do you think any of that is cultural, that you're so attuned to nonverbal, since you are from a more high context culture than I am? I'm from here in the States. Tatiana grew up in Greece. Greece is high context, where paying attention to more than just the words is very embedded in the culture. In the States, we are more literal, more focused on words. I don't know that I am specifically, because of course, anytime we look at cultural trends, we're stereotyping and making general assessment or general trends. But do you think that that's one of the reasons you're so attuned compared to other people in the States?
There are several cultures that are less direct. So you're right. I'm attuned to be listening for the indirectness or reading between the lines. But my students this time, I just finished a course with students who were in Greece, they noted how direct their Greek counterpart students were because they were speaking in English. So there's not an opportunity, if you are listening to someone speaking in a language other than their native language, I don't think there's that much proficiency to sort of slide in innuendos or change your tone. You pretty much say things the way they are, and they come across pretty direct. So it's interesting you asked that, because I do think in high context cultures where there's meaning behind the meaning, there's probably a bigger need for people to listen behind just the words, and hence my training in this way as well.
I think you're really good at understanding big picture too. I think that's another one of your strengths, is kind of, we'll walk out of a meeting that we've been in together and you're making connections that I haven't even thought through yet. You're like, hey, remember when we did this training with them and that client over there, I think they would, and I'm like, oh yeah, because I was so focused on more of the immediate concrete things. And I think you do a great job of seeing the big picture. I think my other strength is, I said my weakness was listening for detail. So we've got listening for details, understanding the big picture, evaluating content is one. Being attuned to subtle tunes with cues. You talked about that one. Mine would be, I think I have a strength of listening with empathy. So listening in a way where I'm truly trying to understand the other person's perspective, and not just what they're thinking, but what they're feeling. And I can walk away with that feeling in myself as well.
And I would say, considering all of these 5, I think we have a visual for that we can show. You are a great listener because of that last one, because you really will ask additional questions. I'm really sorry, that must have sucked. So what did you do next? And what happened? And you really make the person talking to you feel as if they've heard. And if you really care about how they are, not just, you don't give advice, you don't try to unpack a situation, you just stay in the moment and you just listen with empathy here too. We have Jay that talks about, if we want to put up Jay's point, Shelby, who talks a little bit about that he listens, he starts thinking and making connections, and sometimes he loses the details. Jay, that is exactly why I don't pay attention to the details as much. And it's
Jay is smarter than us though, because he remembers them later. I don't remember them later is my problem, Jay.
Yeah, no, I don't. And I have my running friends will tell you I fall behind quite often. So I hear half of the story. So I'll say, now whose cousin, whose wedding are you going to? Talk about details. I mess up all the time. Or they'll say something and go, oh, that person visited? When did that happen? I'm like, oh yeah, that was the hill I fell behind. So physically, you can also miss points, or in a social setting when it's louder or when there's a lot of people talking at the same time. But we're here discussing a virtual setting. And I brought up the example of having a difficult time listening, or because I was involved emotionally in the decisions and the conversation and the involvement of the situation I was in, I wasn't being a very good listener. And I realized in my story that the person I was listening to also was having a hard time delivering this message. So he gave me some cues, probably paused a little more, or didn't match the words with the intonation. Maybe I was reading too much into it. And that's what really made me think, we do so much of this communication through a camera and through a microphone. We really need to make it a point to be better listeners as we do connect too. So all of you who are listening to us right now, do, as you chime in, let us know where you're coming in from and which one of these 5 types of listening, sort of the hats that you wear as you listen, which one of these are you best at, and which ones do you want to work on? What I've noticed with people listening for details or problems, I don't know if you recognize many of our MBA students, especially, who come into our programs having been trained as accountants or problem solvers, consultants. Sometimes it's hard to let go of that role and listen for big picture, or listen for empathy. Immediately they will problem solve, or immediately they will say, well, there's 3 things that you can do to fix this. And we're like, I just want to talk. I don't really want to fix something. So it could be a little bit of training that we've had.
Well, and I think there's a humility piece there too, that when we jump into problem solving mode, that is based on an assumption that we have the best solution. And I think if we're truly humble leaders, or humble colleagues, we start to realize, I'm not the one experiencing the problem. The person experiencing it is likely, if I coach them through some questions, if I listen to them deeply, they may have a better solution that they just haven't unearthed yet, and just some dialogue can bring that out. So I think humility helps with the empathy piece.
Yeah. And just surrendering to not needing to move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
Shelby's asking us, can we talk more about evaluating content? And Shelby, this is part of the connecting the dots in situations, or being able to look at the content and take it for what it is, versus is there's something that's happened in the past that it connects to, or something that could involve in the future. I'm reading, I'd be interested in improving being attuned to subtle cues. Guillermo, I'll talk about that in a little bit. Can we talk about content for a little bit?
I think evaluating content, one of the strategies there, I mean, like we spend a lot of time now talking about empathetic listening, and I'm so glad, because I think it was undervalued for many years. And as Tatiana said, good problem solvers, MBA students, still tend to just miss that one entirely. But as we've put more focus on empathetic listening, I think it's important to say there are still situations where evaluative listening is what we need to do. When someone is trying to sell you something, when someone is making an argument, making a case about something, we need to take off the empathetic hat sometimes and put on the evaluative hat, and really be listening for, are these sources credible? Is there actual data to back up the claim that someone makes? Am I hearing data that is directly linked to the claim? Those are the kinds of things, I think, Shelby, that would help when you've got your evaluator hat on. Like, even thinking about, as you bring new team members onto your team and you're doing interviewing, yes, you want to be empathetic and you want to attune to their subtle cues, but as an interviewer, honestly, your primary responsibility in that moment is evaluate the content. Does this candidate bring to the table what we need them to bring? You're in an evaluative mindset.
I'm putting my teacher hat on now. I just finished reviewing and listening to video presentations and recordings with my students and the clients, you bet you I'm evaluating content. Like, says who? You need some more resources. This works cited is not. So that is probably not the hat that you wear to be a good friend and a good empathetic listener. But if you're being sold things, and maybe in your company you are receiving feedback and pitches all the time, you want to be good at evaluating content. I want to go back to what Guillermo shared with us, and he said, can you speak more into being improving your reading subtle cues? And I always recommend for people to listen beyond just the words, to listen for gestures and facial expressions and pausing and pacing and energy and reading the room beyond just the words. And quite often it may be helpful to listen to someone speaking in a language you do not understand and try to interpret maybe what type of emotion they are sharing, or what could possibly they be talking about. I think those are some of the examples. Mhm.
My favorite activity for this one is to watch a television program that you've not seen with the volume all the way down, and see if you can just pick out what are the relationships, what's the power dynamic, what's the storyline, what's the conflict, or and if you're doing that, it's because you're paying. And then go back and rewatch with the volume up and see how much of it you got right. And so it's good at getting you to pay attention to those. And then my other tip is, when you go into a meeting, when you leave, have a practice, and this will help you tune in during the meeting, whether it's face-to-face or remote, of trying to say, do I know how Tatiana felt about agenda item number 1? Do I know Jay's in this meeting? Do I know how Jay felt about agenda item number 2? Do I know how Shelby felt about agenda item number 3? If I don't have a sense of how my colleagues were responding to things happening in the meeting, I probably wasn't very attuned. So just that practice of making myself check in after the meeting, when I know I'm going to do that to myself, I pay better attention to those nonverbals during the meeting.
Brenda, that in a virtual meeting is so hard to do unless you pin that person, because you're reading nonverbals. You have to pin that person to read them literally, because otherwise you're not sitting next to them, right?
You have to assume that they have their camera on, first of all, or there's no nonverbal to read, right? I know, don't even get you started, right? And that I'm not in a meeting with 40 people so that I have to click through to even see faces. I can only see the 12 or whatever that show up. So, oh my gosh, yes, it's exponentially harder remote.
And that's why we're having this discussion, because the virtual setting makes listening harder. And in this month's newsletter on Tuesday, I talked about several things, like people listening past the words that are said, and listening for those nuances, for those nonverbal cues, for those pauses. What in my stressful listening situation I was listening to and I was paying close attention to. Another one would be the nonverbals that you share. That if Brenda is speaking and I just sit like this, I'm not giving her anything. It's the poker face. You've even seen some of the apps where people sort of look like they're listening and they're just holding a screen and they're off.
No way.
Now yes, it exists. So you need to do a little bit of this. You need to do a little bit of this. You're kidding me. Anything that you would do to go back and forth without interrupting, you can say, wow, really? So being verbal in your responses beyond the that we do in a face-to-face situation. Another one of the tips that I shared is, in a virtual setting, using silence. And someone said to me the other day, I don't even know how to do that. That's so darn uncomfortable. So if Brenda says to me, I need to think about that a little bit. And actually you do that. You may not know, but sometimes you'll say, I need to think about that. And you go like this. And I don't know if you're faking it, but I can feel like the sound of Jeopardy, the show, the game show that plays in the US. but you're thinking. And if you are on the receiving end, it's okay to have silence, because silence is golden. You process and you need that. Another suggestion that I made was, instead of paraphrasing, let me see if I get this right. If Brenda ends a sentence, go ahead and tell me something.
Well, I'm going to tell you that I think listening is really hard, but more so when it's remote. And I'm even worried about our learners. Like, how are they listening right now? Their cameras are off.
Yeah. Listening is hard when we are remote. Absolutely. I just took your words and repeated them to showcase that I'm pretty much running the video back and repeating that to say that I hear that, especially if you're sharing something that has a theme, that's the one key point you want to make. I may even want to write that down so I can repeat it back to you to share that I am listening. We always talk about, in communication, asking questions. We want to ask bigger, open-ended questions to get our person that we are listening to share more data, to share more information. And then in the newsletter, I talked about really being empathetic, which is harder to do in a virtual setting.
I want to ask some questions. So in that scenario, that difficult conversations you described, how did you practice empathy? I mean, what did that feel like? What did that sound like? What did that look like?
I was revving myself up to have a confrontation. Like, why did this happen? And as
What are you
soon
going
as
to do about it?
yeah, what can I do? What could I have done differently? And as soon as I realized that the messenger was also not comfortable with this, I really took a step back and thought, I really need to just let them speak more and make them feel comfortable. And I thought, it's okay. This is what we have to deal with. And I'm going to be diplomatic, and I'm going to take the high road and take this information as it is. I want to communicate the way that I feel, but I let them talk more. It just completely changed. It's sort of like I entered the room and I took a deep breath and sat down and was able to have a better conversation.
Oh,
I
yeah.
predicted I would be a worse listener, and I think I was a little better because of that. It's okay.
I like that idea. It's almost like you surrendered your agenda. Not that
Yes.
we can always do that. Sometimes we have to stay on point. We have to get certain things said. I use a General Peter Pace quote once in a while. He was a Joint Chief of Staff. So I think you may have been. Was he a
Worked with him closely, yeah.
supporting him when he was here? So you've had a lot of more interactions with him than I have. But he talks about how he'll wake up in the morning, and like while he's shaving, he's going through his head what meetings he has to go to. And he'll say, now, this is what I absolutely have to say. This is what I cannot let happen. And I think, you were able to relax with your agenda because you knew the one or two absolute things you had to get said in that meeting. And then that the rest you could surrender and flow with the conversational partner, especially when you realized he was stressed about was finding this just as challenging as you were. I saw somebody post recently about wanting to enter into a conversation by asking herself, how do I want to feel when this conversation is over? And I think it sounds like you did a really good job of thinking through, when this is over, I still want to be colleagues with this person. I still want to have a good relationship with this person. I want to feel that I've advocated for myself, but that I've also heard out his perspective. If that's a different approach to a meeting, then I'm going to get my way. I'm going to get this done.
I'm going to win. I'm going to win.
Yes.
Yeah. You can't, I don't think you can be a good listener when you say I'm going to win. There's also in a virtual setting, in a face-to-face setting, there's also the opportunity to come back with an email and repeat, or to paraphrase, or to say, here's what I hear the situation being, where you don't have to put pressure on yourself to do it in the moment. I find that sometimes it's useful to use that. I do a lot of practicing of my listening. I like listening to podcasts because then I don't have to process all the visual cues. And we're going to say this in a little bit of ways to make listening better. Not all listening has to have cameras on. If everyone has their cameras off and you're the only one speaking. Why don't we get on an audio call, for goodness sakes? And we put that pressure on the poor speaker. And there's all this sort of, well, camera is off again, or this person came on, or this person is fumbling and gets the camera on and the light is terrible and we can't see them. But before we talk about that, what, Brenda, I talked about my challenging situation. What has been one for you?
I actually find learning events like this really challenging. And I hate to admit that because I'm out here producing content for learning events, but I will in a face-to-face setting, learning for me is delightful. I'm completely tuned in. I never think about other things, but there's something about having all these distractions or not even really blocking time on my calendar. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm going to pop into that live while I clear email. Well, we don't really, you don't listen well and multitask. So I think that's been a change for me, is that I have to be more intentional about removing the distractions and focusing on the listening. But I'll tell you the other one that is, you talked about a challenging one-on-one. For me, the remote listening is particularly challenging for meetings, small group meetings, maybe, where a lot of things happen that create poor listening, I think. Some of them for me and some of the meetings I've attended are the camera's off. Some people are off, some people are on, or like you said, back and forth. That's distracting. Or people who have dual monitors. And so they're talking or they're listening, but they're listening like this. And I can't tell, are they just ignoring me? Are they doing something else? I feel very distracted by that whole profile vision. People that will, sometimes I see in the chat. Now your chat has been delightful because people are entering questions and comments that are absolutely on point to what we're discussing. But haven't you seen the chat sometimes like blow up on some irrelevant off-topic thing? Or worse yet, people don't want it in the chat. And so there's texting. So you got this whole text thread happening in addition to the chat, in addition to the conversation. Wow.
And the emojis, you know, which are great. I'd rather just put out a little clap or a hand, a heart, instead of writing a comment. But for me, the meeting organizer is tripped up immediately from the get-go when they have to manage these people, communicate a message, and then this goes on. How difficult is that? So what do we do with that? Speaking of, I've got to close the window because I hear dogs and outside.
Well, we're not hearing the dogs. Just that's good. But the dogs are getting to you. So, okay. Well, I think a couple of things. When the conversation, I think we need to be intentional about cameras on or camera off, and not have half of us doing one and half of us doing another. If you've got meetings where people can show up and never have their cameras on because we don't really plan to involve them, then let's rethink whether they needed to be there. You know, if they're just a spectator, you don't need them at the meeting. Send them, use your AI to write up a summary of the meeting and send it out as an email. Don't make them.
Jada makes a good point. She says virtual meetings is a problem for me. Yesterday, I worked with a large company and there were several people in the training. It was a skills training, and the culture, I was warned about this. Nobody had their cameras on. And you know me, like, hi everyone. And I see all these black boxes. I'm like, okay, it's okay. Take a deep breath. But I knew this was happening. So one thing that I did, I created a Slido, you know, sort of off chat with an ask me anything. And they all were using QR codes. So there were questions coming in, but I didn't see them immediately. I have them. And later I recorded an audio message answering all the questions I didn't get to. But it was brilliant. I don't know how I came up with this idea, but at the end, the facilitator said, we've got several questions that got several thumbs up. So I'm going to start with those first. So I was able to do that instead of being distracted, but also the learners anonymously were able to drop those questions, because once the chat is going on or a question is asked. So I wonder if that would help you as a learner be more engaged. The problem is the person conducting the meeting cannot follow the plan of the meeting and be answering questions at the same time. It would be just crazy to be able to do that.
So maybe a new strategy is that when we're running or participating in remote meetings, we need backup facilitation. Maybe you always have someone that you've assigned to sort of be scanning the questions that are coming in, highlighting the ones that seem like you need to talk to, or holding them for the more relevant place. I think another thing that co-facilitator role could do is, we were just talking about the fact that don't invite people if you don't expect them to talk. I mean, that's the whole point. Face-to-face time, whether it's in person or remote, if synchronous time is valuable, and we should be using it for conversation, for real discussion. So I think another great role that a co-facilitator can play is kind of scanning who hasn't talked yet, and then bringing them into the conversation, holding space for them to get their voice in. We've heard so much about the connection between psychological safety and trust within a team and equalizing talk time. And yet, while more and more of us know that connection's there, I haven't seen that translate much into facilitators adamantly protecting time or holding space for people, doing round the group exercises, following the 3 then me guideline of, once I've spoken, I don't talk again until 3 different people have had a chance to share. There are lots of really sort of prescriptive ways that we can build more inclusivity into our meetings by sharing that talk time.
Yeah. One of our friends, Julie, is here. And if you want to show that from Benish, and she says, we use Q&A and turn off the chat so the presenter is not distracted. So we like working with you because of that.
And those of us who presented for Benish, we're like, thank you, Benish. This is great.
But the need for people, I think the learning happens when there's that chatter. There should be a way for people to say, yeah, me too. You know, what do you think about this? If we were in class, we'd be making eye contact, nodding. That's what some of that is about at the time. And I don't want to squash that, but we have to prepare, or I would say we have to protect the person who's sharing the information. We could go into meeting management strategies for all, but really deciding, do we need to sit in the same room virtually or physically for this information? Or could I create a voice memo and send it out to everyone and say, please, rank order your 3 ideas the way, and we will come and discuss that. If you give people specific tasks to do, they will think through things and come better prepared. So that's super helpful. What other systems?
I just wanted to just reiterate that idea that you just said, that this concept that there's a balancing act to be had, because while I was saying, the chat and the text threads are distracting, at the same time, as our teams are more and more remote, we become more and more remote. And I know a lot of team leaders, formal and informal leaders, are excited about finding ways to continue building rapport and team dynamics for their virtual teams. And so some of that chatter is natural. And I don't want to, like you said, I don't want to squelch it if it's happening, but there's a balance to, okay, we're having this chatter. The speaker doesn't even know this chatter is happening. So in a real meeting, if there's a lot of side chatter, you pause and you wait and you lean in and you laugh with them, and that builds rapport, and that's awesome.
Yeah.
In a remote meeting, you're just powering through, and then people are missing those important content pieces.
But don't you think that a lot, and maybe our learners know this as well, for me as a speaker, even if I have slides to share, if I use, I mean, show them next to me versus me going away and everyone's looking at the visuals, I always will come back to the fishbowl where I can see everyone say, what do you think? Who wants to push back? Any ahas? So allowing some time in your agenda for that discussion, and maybe doing pre-reads or pre-shares, whatever it may be, to help people. But the problem is when they're too busy and they don't do that. So you have half the people that come to the meeting and they have something to share, and everyone is like, what are we doing? Who's there? Like, what's this about? And they're texting you, right?
You had
So
mentioned taking notes in that really hard conversation that you had. And taking notes is one way that I can keep myself focused. I just think it's important,
yeah,
especially if it's just a one-on-one, to say that that's what you're doing. I'm just because you're looking away then, or so I think it's important to say you're taking notes, but that
yes.
definitely, whether it's a learning
And
sort of
show that you're taking notes, right? So because
yes, get that
if you do
notepad up
that,
high enough.
otherwise, if you're doing this and you're looking down without cueing the notes, people may assume you're
Right.
on your phone.
Another
Uh,
technique oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I prefer in those tough meetings to stand, not because I want to be in fighting mode, but because I'm going to get less, how do I say that? Less, I want to be all in, and
Yeah.
being all in with all my senses, I'm cued better kinesthetically to stand in that situation.
And for me, I think it's almost the opposite. Like if I'm
Yeah,
standing, I'm wiggling, I'm moving, I'm thinking about walking out. But yeah, I need to sit. I need my notepad out. I even get my calendar out sometime for those learning situations or meetings.
mhm,
And I'm calendaring to do items based on the meeting. And that really keeps me accountable to the listening because I'm like, oh, I'm going to do something about this learning that and as I'm writing down what I want to do or encouraging people in learnings, get your calendars as you're thinking of things that today for our learners. If
yeah.
you've heard a tip that you want to use and you're thinking, oh, this would be great when I have that conversation with so and so, or this would be great in that meeting, please pull your calendars out and put that reminder in your calendar right now. It's going to keep you focused and it's going to make you accountable to the learning that's happening here.
Or at times, what I will do with the notepad, I'm writing down what's coming in my brain and distracting me. Like, I've got to send this email. I'll just make note of that on the top right so I can park that somewhere and go to that parking lot later, correct? So, yes, on standing, someone said I do that when I present. Don't
Yeah.
forget hashtag stronger so we can raffle off a mug, a tumbler. What other challenges do you have listening in virtual settings? Because in the newsletter, I didn't talk about make sure that your environment is quiet, make sure you're in a concentrated space, make sure you set up your space well enough and you have water or you're working. I didn't cover some of that because we hear so much of this. I think ever since COVID, we've all been trained to be better in the virtual setting. But as you said, a lot of what we do now is standard procedure. It has nothing to do with the pandemic. So for our learners, what are other challenges that you have that we may not have covered? Systems, we talked about having a door person, having someone be a co-facilitator, deciding if people have their cameras off, maybe you communicate information in another way, deciding maybe you could do an audio where everyone goes for a half-hour walk during their lunch. And instead of doing an all hands where you're looking at each other, everyone can, maybe in all hands, they need to share slides, but maybe that's a good way for people to check in and socialize. Do we have any other systems or ways that we can help our learners, Brenda?
I'm going to respond to a couple of the questions over here. Well, Adriana, you'd mentioned pausing to ask, does this make sense? I catch myself saying that a lot. And I've been working to change the way I phrase that because if I say, does that make sense? You can say yes. And of course, what makes sense, you may not have understood it the way I thought that you understood it, but it still made sense in your way. But then you go off and you do something entirely different than I thought we were going to do. So I've been trying to ask, change out that question of, does it make sense to, so where would you get started? Or what do you think will be most challenging? Or what would be your first step? Those types of questions tend to get, I'm hoping they will get me better feedback than when I say, does that make sense? Does that make
Yeah.
sense? But I do say that a lot.
Is a closed-ended questions.
Yeah.
Yes, no. Well, if you get to know, then there's more. But when you ask, where would you get started? You recognize if people are using this information in an actionable way, and you are getting more data. Just like when you're speaking to someone in a one-on-one meeting, you can answer or you can ask open-ended questions to get more information.
Yeah.
Good stuff. We haven't solved the world's problem on virtual listening, but we're sure scratching
We
at the
are.
surface.
We are. Guillermo had talked about, so we were talking about surrendering your agenda with your difficult situation. He said that that might mean you gave up ownership, and that could be seen. So how do you balance that? I don't want the last word, and yet I've got to make that case for myself. I think
Yeah.
that there's a tactic called a contrast statement. So I say, I do want you to feel heard. I don't want you to think that I don't have a position on this, because I do,
Sure.
and so it's like, this is what I want, this is what I don't want. And to actually say that out loud can be helpful,
Yeah.
those contrast drills. And I think just saying to yourself and to the person, I'm going to paraphrase back, because I think I understand you and I want to make sure that I do. I also want to clarify that understanding doesn't mean agreeing. So
Agreeing.
that's, I
Oh,
think, one of the most important things about empathy is people get that confused all the time. They think that if I choose to understand you, it means I agree with you. And that's not what empathy is. It's, I understand where you're coming from. I still have a different perspective. And I understand why those are hard to hold on to. They seem polarized. They seem like they're a dichotomy. And so the paradox of empathetic listening is holding both of those two truths that seem paradoxical, holding them simultaneously. That, yes, I get it. I feel for you and I understand you. And I disagree with you. And they're
yeah.
both true.
And there has to be a trusting relationship there for that communication to happen. And hence, virtual listening is difficult when there is no relationship. We enter these meetings as if we enter in a room with strangers and we have to play nice or share information. It's a challenge. And they're on different time zones and on different parts of the planet with different biases and other contexts. So again, job security, we can talk about this forever because it's ever evolving. And I'm hoping that by listening to us today, you have a few good ideas, or at least be aware that you're not alone in thinking this is a challenging context, and maybe take some of the ideas that we gave you on having people help you for people being good listeners when you share a message, or you being a better listener when you are in one-on-one or group settings. Any other closing words, Brenda?
Oh my goodness. It's a challenge, but listening is a skill. Remote listening is yet a new skill. You don't, all those skills you've learned and practiced for face-to-face meetings certainly help. And then add a few new tricks and tips to your toolkit of great listening, and just know that it's not an innate skill, it's a learnable skill, and that we're cheering for you to be the best remote listeners possible.
And the fact that you are in this live told us that you care enough about the topic. Shelby, I think we're ready to give away a tumbler for #stronger. This keeps everyone into the meeting until the very end. This is my favorite part, where we push a little button and it raffles away people's names that have been here. And the winner is, drum roll. And this is when I go to the, oh, Jay, oh my goodness. Jay comes to most all of our meetings and our lives, and he's one of our favorite friends. And Jay, you can email us your address and we'll make sure that that gets to you. I'm not sure if it's going to come from Greece or if it's going to come from the US, but it will come to you. So friends, thank you for joining us. Thank you for listening attentively. Thank you for working on making your skills, your very, very important people skills in this virtual setting, stronger. Brenda, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.